This week begins with a single word. A word that reverberates 100 years later, often in romantic tales, that showed the might of colonial troops, that brought new heroes to the international spotlight and shame to old ones. One word that the world is not likely to forget: Gallipoli. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. When we left off, the Second Battle of Ypres had begun. The first German offensive on the Western Front this year, while days before, the British had mined the Germans from below at Hill 60. At Ypres, the Germans used poison gas successfully for the first time in the war with devastating effect, but their progress was stalled by Canadian forces. In the east, the Austrians and Germans were building up for yet another attempt to push the Russians out of the mountains. In Africa, Union forces were routing the Germans, and in eastern Turkey, the Armenian city of Van was under heavy siege by the Turks. I'll start right with the big news of the week, the moment many of you have been waiting for months: the Gallipoli landings. On April 25, 1915, French, British, Australian, and New Zealander forces landed in the Straits of the Dardanelles. The same day, the Russian Black Sea Fleet bombarded the Turkish forts on the Bosporus. This was part of a campaign to seize Istanbul and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Okay, the landings. Two separate landing areas were chosen, one at Cape Helles at the southern tip, and one further north across from the town of Maidos. The idea was that the attack from the south would push the Turks back to the northern landing and they'd be trapped. The landing on the northern beach, codenamed Z Beach, took place just before dawn. Now, 2 months earlier, Lord Kitchener, British Secretary of State for War, who didn't think much of either Turkish military skills or British colonial armies, had sarcastically claimed that the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps troops, ANZACs, would be adequate for a cruise in the Marmara, and so it was they, diverted from heading to the Western Front to fight this supposedly quick and easy battle against the Turks, who were put ashore. But not at the proposed landing site, Gaba which would have led to an advance across level ground, but further north at Ari Burnu, beneath the heights of Chunuk Bair. Commander Charles Dix, in charge of the landing, said straight off the bat, "Tell the colonel that the damn fools have landed us a mile too far north." The landing spot would be christened ANZAC Cove. The landing itself was mostly unopposed, but after a few hours, the Turkish battery near Gaba began shelling the soldiers on the landing beach. Those men began to push inland, taking heavier casualties, but still pressing on, up steep terrain, trying to take the high ground. Late in the afternoon, the Turks holding the crest ran out of ammunition and began to withdraw. Now, as some Australian troops approached the crest, a Turkish divisional commander named Mustafa Kemal, who would one day be known as Ataturk, the father of all Turks, reached the men who were pulling out, and since they had no ammunition, he ordered them to halt, fix bayonets, and lie down facing the enemy. As soon as they lay down, so did the enemy, giving the Turks some time. One of Kemal's top regiments was on the eastern slopes of Chunuk Bair at the time, and they managed to arrive at the crest before the Australians could with a battery of guns. Kemal realized that if the crest were not held, then the whole position on the peninsula might be lost. One Turkish and 2 Arab regiments soon arrived as reinforcements, and the fighting continued the rest of the day. To say it was bloody was an understatement. Wave after wave of Turks and Arabs threw themselves down on the ANZACs, were destroyed by machine gun fire, and then more men climbed over the bodies of the previous wave. There was no rest, and by nightfall, both sides were completely exhausted. Kemal tried to get his men to continue the fight, but nobody would or even could. The Ottoman forces still held the crest, while the ANZACs held the western slopes of Chunuk Bair. General Sir Ian Hamilton, when informed of the situation, said that it was okay because the southern force that would advance in the morning should take off the pressure. This was about as optimistic as one could possibly be. At W Beach, it was the Lancashire Fusiliers who went ashore, rowing the final distance. However, the preliminary naval bombardment had neither eliminated the barbed wire nor the Turkish defenders, who waited in silence until suddenly sweeping the beach with machine guns. The men were so tightly packed in their boats that some dead men continued to sit upright. The water was deep, so many men leaving the boats with 70 pounds of equipment drowned. Many were killed trying to pass the barbed wire. In fact, by the time the beach was secure, of 950 men landing, well over half had been killed or wounded. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the Fusiliers for bravery that day, and the beach was known in future as Lancashire Landing. The initial landing attempt saw the invaders enfiladed and cut down in droves from 4 Maxim guns placed in a Turkish fort and a castle covering the beach from the left and the right. Well, those that actually made it ashore. The Turks in the fort were not forced back and the landing not really secure till the following day. Now the other 3 beaches, S, X, and Y, were hardly defended, and eventually the Turks on W Beach were outflanked by Allied troops from other beaches and beaten back by forces that soon outnumbered them 10-1. And as the various beachheads were linked up, it seemed that the Allies, in spite of the carnage, might manage to push the Turks far back and take all the forts on the European side of the straits. The fleet could then sail into Istanbul. Indeed, by sunset on the 26th, the Allies had landed more than 30,000 troops. However, they had also suffered more than 20,000 dead and wounded. Here's an account from that day I found in Martin Gilbert's The First World War. Men had lost arms and legs. Brains oozed out of shattered skulls, and lungs protruded from riven chests. Many had lost their faces and were unrecognizable to their friends. One poor chap had lost his nose and most of his face, and we were obliged to take off an arm, the other hand, and extract 2 bullets like shark's teeth from his thigh. I saw him the next morning being carried to the mortuary. The Ottoman forces withdrew on the 27th across the peninsula to the hill Achi Baba, and there they fended off British attackers. The British didn't even take their first objective, the village of Krithia. From first to last, the Narrows remained under Turkish control. And it must be said, there were times when the scale of incompetent leadership made a mockery of the bravery of the Allied troops. On the Turkish side, though the generals were German, the inspiration of Mustafa Kemal helped keep the invading forces stuck at the beachheads. But the landings themselves had succeeded, and people throughout Europe were so confident of an imminent Allied victory that on the 26th, Italy signed a secret treaty committing her to joining the Allies, and on Gallipoli, ever more reinforcements were brought in on both sides. That's right, Italy had just committed itself to joining the war. This would involve attacking Austria-Hungary at the other end of the country from where the Austrian armies had been desperately fighting the Russians in the Carpathians. But things weren't as desperate for the empire as they'd been only a few weeks ago. German reinforcements in the nick of time had prevented the Russians from breaking out of the mountains and onto the Hungarian plains, and more German troops were arriving in secret, preparing for yet another offensive, but this time with heavy German forces. This week also saw another major milestone date, as April 24th was declared the Armenian Day of Mourning. That day, Catholicos Georg V, head of the Armenian Church, appealed in vain to American President Woodrow Wilson to intervene in what was turning from massacres to Armenian genocide. The news of the killings and deportations of Armenians in Turkey, which had been going on for 2 weeks now, became widely publicized throughout Europe and the United States. On April 28th, the German vice consul at Erzurum, Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, was asked by Berlin to intervene against the massacres, but not in any way that would interfere with the activities of the authorities. So, do nothing. I mention him because, as a side note, von Scheubner-Richter was, after the war, one of the first supporters of Adolf Hitler. He was killed in the beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923, marching by Hitler's side. Anyway, also on April 24th, 250 Armenian intellectuals were arrested in Istanbul. They were sent to Shankri and Ayash, where they were later killed. And further east, tens of thousands of Armenians under siege in the city of Van still held out. But in Van province, 32,000 Armenians were reported killed by the end of April. And the killing continued in the west as well, as the Second Battle of Ypres raged throughout the week near Saint-Julien. The Germans actually pierced the British lines on the 26th, but by the end of the week, their offensive is halted. And that was the week, a week of milestones still remembered today. The Gallipoli landings that thrust the soldiers of Australia and New Zealand into the fray for the first time, the spotlight shining on Mustafa Kemal, and more sinister, the official beginning of the Armenian genocide. And the Italians would go to war. and the Germans and Austrians would tackle the Russians again, and the Western Front would remain a stubborn stalemate. There were so many ways to die that in hindsight, opening yet another front seems almost a criminal waste of life, but it was still happening again and again, and it was certainly not happening well. This week at the Dardanelles, the seas actually ran red with blood. Do you realize how frightening that is? How that must have looked? But this Allied plan of Winston Churchill's, this back door to win the war, how ill-conceived was the whole concept to begin with? Germany was not going to be beaten by an attack on Turkey. There was no back door to attacking Germany. There were no allies whose removal would make Germany collapse. Gallipoli is often romanticized in films and books, but for all of the individual moments of glory, it was an exercise in butchery, pure and simple. And it was butchery that caused misery at the home front, tore apart families, and demanded that women pay a high price working in ammunition factories and taking on other duties at home. You can click here to check out our special episode about women in World War I. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Joseph Dodd. Hooray, Joseph! If you want to know more about how you can support our show, please check out our Patreon page. And if you want to see some exclusive behind-the-scenes footage, check us out on Facebook. See you next time.